You're watching Enterprise Architecture with your host, Nikolai. In today's world, enterprise architecture is crucial to building nice and scalable applications. In this video, we're going to talk about what is an API. We're actually going to start to build one in C# and .NET. But before we get started, I would like to take you into the drawing board. So first we can start with what is an API. An API stands for Application Programming Interface. Let's say you are on a desktop machine and you're browsing the web. Let's say you are watching some news articles or reading some news articles and you start to wonder, where does the data actually come from? Well, it usually comes from a server, which are somewhere in the world. But usually these days, the server is hosted in a big room with other servers in a cloud environment. For instance, AWS or Azure. What we care about though is what does the server, let's say this server, use. It could be that this server is acting as a web server, and it could be that it is using Kestrel. Kestrel is something ASP.NET Core are using behind the hood. ASP.NET Core is a framework which lets you build web applications. So let's just assume that this server is using Kestrel as the underlying framework, which are dependent on ASP.NET Core and vice versa, and in itself is a web server. Alright, so now we got all of the jargon out of the way. We can now take a look at what the web server actually does. Now the web server are in a cloud. It is in a cloud provider called Azure. And the web server is using ASP.NET Core underneath the hood, which we are going to take a look at really soon. Alright, so get back to the example. You're browsing the web. You have some articles here, a picture of some sort, and you're wondering what happens. Usually when you load the website, you're doing a GET request. You're getting the request, the address which you're going to. This could be newsarticles.com, for example. The GET request actually uses HTTP to talk to the web server, which are somewhere in the world, like that. The web server then receives an HTTP GET request and it checks what it wants to get, and then it actually sends back the information it wants the client to get. The client in this example is the desktop, as you can see here. The client could also be a mobile application. The mobile application is a mobile app, and it also does the same GET request. It also uses HTTP, and it does the same request to the web server like that. So where are we going with all of this? When the server in the cloud receives the GET request, it thinks, oh, I need to deliver something back to the client. Usually he will deliver something called JSON. JSON is a notation. It stands for JavaScript Object Notation. It is usually used in web applications or web APIs like this. So now let's say this is a web API, which we're actually going to build really soon. And the JSON we get back can now be read by the client. It could be the phone. It could also be the desktop. The website, though, are usually using React, Vue, or just pure JavaScript. And it knows how to handle the JSON. And it usually loops through the JSON in order to show some nice output on the website or on the phone. Right now, you're probably eagerly waiting to get into the code. And we are going to get into it right now. Well, first I want you to download Visual Studio Code, or VS Code for short. You can also use Rider, which is one of my favorite IDEs, as well as Visual Studio in general, just for VS. But Visual Studio Code is the one we will be using because it's easy to download and it's nice for beginners. You don't need all of the rider and things in Visual Studio. That's why we go with Visual Studio Code. So download the Visual Studio Code, which is an editor. You can download it in the URL given in the description down below. Once you have everything up and going, we will actually get right into it. Alright, so now we have Visual Studio Code open. But what I would like you to do is actually open the terminal right away. Search for terminal, do an ls, go to the desktop, again, make it bigger, and then make a directory called tut for tutorial. And then we can go into the tut like that for tutorial, and then we can do we actually don't need to make a directory right now, but we can also just say make directory and then do C# app, something like that, along those lines. Alright, so what we have here is a C# app folder. What you're met with is an empty folder. But inside of here, we can do a .NET, new, and then web, and then add API. We can also do some stuff like auth and so on, which are things we can add as a parameter. But for now, we only need .NET new web API. Here we could give it a name, but now it will actually just do it inside of the C# app. Do enter, it creates the web API. And if you do ls, you will see all of the files inside of here. What we then can do is actually to open the folder, go to desktop, tut, C# app, and then click open. Trust all the authors because you are the author. And then we can see we have program.cs, weather forecast, and a controller folder. We can then click on required assets to build, click on yes. Alright, so we can then take a look at the weather forecast controller first. Here. And if you want, you can also just click here and then take a look. Alright, so we have a weather forecast controller. It displays some information. If you run the project like this, then you will notice that there's nothing here until you write weather forecast. So this is the data the API is giving back. Do you remember back to what we talked about for not long ago? We were here and we talked about the API. The API was here and it was giving back information. In this case, it gives back weather forecast information. And if you see, it comes back as this type of data. This is the JSON. It's identified as a list here. It starts with a list, and this is an object. This is another object, and as you probably can guess, this is the third object, and so on. The date here is a string. The temperature is a Celsius, and it's an integer from what I can see. It's in Fahrenheit. The temperature Fahrenheit is 42. Still an integer, and the summary is a string. So basically we have temperature in Celsius, we have temperature in Fahrenheit, and then we had the summary, which was in string. And all of this information comes to us as JSON. It means that we can consume it, because right now it's kind of boring. Because what can we actually do with this? Nothing. We can list it right here, but it's not really pretty. What could be more interesting is have an application that would consume it. That's something we will get into in our later videos. But for now, we are building out the API, because if not, the client would not be able to consume it. Alright, so now we can stop the application, because we actually don't want to have a weather forecast. We want to build something else. just go ahead and delete it. Actually, what we can build is a news controller. We could also say news article controller to make it more specific that that's what we're after. So create a new news article controller inside of here. Notice that we are having installed GitHub Copilot right here. We don't want to disable it. I just want to have it on so you can see how it helps us write the API thing. It wants us to have a namespace called news article and then controllers. I'm fine with that. Didn't give us that much now. Congratulations for staying to the end. Yeah, you reached the end. But just go to part 2 and you'll be right where you were